Thank you. It's great to be here, it really is, and thank you all for coming. In the decade and a half since the publication of What Art Is, the Aesthetic Theory of Ayn Rand, Lou Torres and I have been actively engaged in promoting the basic principles of Rand's theory of art in the often hostile world beyond that of her admirers. In this section, I'll explore what I've learned from that experience, lessons that I believe can be applied to other areas of Rand's thought. But before I offer specific suggestions for how to sell Rand's ideas, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the first-hand experience Lou and I have had since the publication of What Art Is. One of our most surprising and in many ways gratifying experiences and exchanges with individuals beyond the circle of Rand's admirers was with the late Jacques Barzun. Are there any of you not familiar with that name? He was America's preeminent cultural historian. Going back, when I was a student at Barnard in the 50s, he was one of the revered members of the faculty, along with Lionel Trilling and who was the other great scholar there? The name escapes me. But he's written a slew of books. He always wrote for a general audience. He was not just an academic, he was also a public intellectual. Famous books, Teacher in America, a book on Marx, a book on Romanticism, and in many ways his ideas on Romanticism were similar to Rand's. At any rate, we first met him in 1988 at a lecture he gave at the 92nd Street Y in New York. We were drawn to the lecture entitled, "What Are Critics Good For?" because we had so valued an earlier essay by him on the subject that we were hoping to reprint it in Aristos, our journal on the arts that we co-edit. In the lecture's Q&A period, despite considerable trepidation owing to Barzun's venerable status and well-earned, I mean, his position in the culture is one that's well-founded. His venerable status as a cultural scholar, one of us was bold enough to ask if he was familiar with Ayn Rand's collected essays on art and aesthetics in the Romantic Manifesto. Not long before, I should note, in a similar lecture setting in New York, we had asked the same question of another speaker. That speaker, a writer and editor of some reputation, I don't remember his name now, had replied so dismissively that he prompted derisive laughter in the audience among the audience members, many of whom apparently shared his low esteem of Rand. In contrast, Jacques Barzun responded, without a hint of condescension, no, that he didn't know of Rand's work. He said, "Should I?" And we said, "We think that you would find things in it that you agree with, that you would find it of interest." This was after the formal part. There was an informal reception, so we were able to speak to him one-on-one. He took out in this, he was in his late 80s or early, he was, well, no, not that early. He was in his 80s, but he was already, seated and obviously elderly and fatigued, reached into his pocket and was about to write down the name of the book. And we said, "Please let us have the pleasure of sending you a copy," which we did, and we put him on our complimentary mailing list for Aristos. That was the only time we saw him in person. But it was the beginning of a decades-long correspondence. And one of the measures of this man was that he had many correspondences like this. There's a website devoted to him, and his support and interaction with people, not necessarily of any known stature, but of engaging with people in a positive way was quite amazing. Highlights, incidentally, we published highlights of the correspondence in the Jacques Barzun compendium on the Aristos website, so you might enjoy reading that. 4 years later, Lou and I published our critical introduction to Rand's philosophy of art, which we began by serializing in Aristos. It was just, I think it was 4 issues of Aristos. And we put it out there. We had a little symposium in New York, and we got feedback from people. And we had long been waiting for some of the objectivist philosophers to do something substantial on Rand's theory of art, but nobody was doing it. So Lou and I said, you know, we'll do the best we can. At any rate, people encouraged us, Tibor Machan and Doug Rasmussen and others encouraged us to go ahead and turn it into book form. But when we published the serialized version in Aristos, we received an unsolicited note from Jacques Barzun saying, I quote, "I find it excellent in 2 points of view. One, it is so detailed that I feel confident of its fairness to the text. And 2, I admire the analytic skill with which merits and demerits are laid out. The reader has a chance to weigh their application instead of reading only conclusions and judgments." In subsequent correspondence, Barzun encouraged us also in the project to expand it into book form, which we did nearly a decade later in What Art Is, and that could be the subject of a book itself. But as fate would have it, however, the publication of Barzun's own magnum opus, From Dawn to Decadence, coincided with our book's release. So he was not able to give us a blurb for the cover, which would have been, of course, invaluable. But in August 2000, after his own promotion had died down, we received an unsolicited note from him. "At last I have found enough uninterrupted time to read What Art Is from end to end, and I report my enthusiastic appreciation and enjoyment. Your research, reflection, and writing are worthy of all praise. Your scholarly treatment of modern art, your appendices, your notes are full of facts, comparisons, and judgments that come to grips suggestively with the elusive double topic, art and the arts." Now, you can imagine what this meant to us from a man who has spent his whole life studying art and culture. 3 months later, in response to a birthday greeting we sent him, he wrote to thank us for that and added this follow-up unexpectedly, his follow-up to the previous message we had gotten from him about the book. "As it happens, I was going to drop you a line to tell you that I have reread a large portion of What Art Is and have been brought to regret that you anchored it to Ayn Rand's philosophy. Your work and its merits are so extensively yours that I wish it stood forth independent of any other's ideas on the subject. My wish and hope is to hear that a second edition of your book will exhibit your original thought to the full, even if here and there your critique of Ayn Rand serves her topical purpose." To which we responded as follows: "While your recent remarks do us honor, we think they may not sufficiently credit Rand. In truth, though we ourselves have many reservations about her as a person and about some aspects of her thought and approach, not to mention the often cult-like following she inspired, Our understanding of art, as of many other things, is immeasurably indebted to her. Without the clear direction she provided, not only regarding the cognitive and emotional function of art, but also on basic principles of epistemology, our ideas would never have crystallized as they did. We should add, too, that we are convinced she has not yet received her due as a thinker more generally, though this has begun to change. That said, we are well aware that while Rand's name on our book ensures a steady readership of those already interested in her ideas, it may prove a deterrent to gaining the much wider audience we aim to reach. Now, my new book, Who Says That's Art, may be thought of in some respects as the second edition that Barzun envisioned for what art is, at least in regard to the visual arts, and without my co-author, because having almost come to divorce or homicide over the first book, we were not going to repeat that experience. So, in writing it, therefore, I couldn't ignore our experience with what art is. The sad truth is, as I briefly note in the preface to Who Says That's Art, that Ayn Rand's name was cause for what art is to be ignored by many who should have found it of interest. In that light, a key question that must be considered is, what is our goal in selling Rand's ideas? Is it primarily to convince people of her unique importance as a thinker? Or is it to disseminate ideas that we think would advance human well-being? In the 15 years since the publication of What Art Is, I have clearly opted for the latter alternative. That has not meant failing to acknowledge Rand, however. It has simply meant a different emphasis. Can I report that this approach has transformed the culture? Hardly. What it has done, however, is to get people at least to listen to attend to the ideas. Evidence of that is having articles reprinted in peer-reviewed journals, cited in work by others, and included on course reading lists. And that's the necessary beginning without which no transformation can occur. One significant indicator is the contrast between the critical reception of the Romantic Manifesto and that of Who Says That's Art. When the Romantic Manifesto was published in 1969, it was generally dismissed by reviewers as having little merit. For details on this, see Lou's and my essay, Critical Neglect of Ayn Rand's Theory of Art, which is listed in the outline for the session, and it's online, so you can access it online. It was printed, and it was originally going to be a chapter in the book, but the book was already so much longer than we had originally contracted for that we had the brilliant idea of publishing it in the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies. So it would see the light of day under a different cover. In the critical literature on the Romantic Manifesto, there was virtually no substantive discussion of Rand's theory of art. In the scant references that there were to it, reviewers objected to such aspects as her pretentious and quasi-philosophical jargon. And reviewers also criticized such matters as her shrill prejudices. Kirkus Reviews, one of America's most influential book review sources, snidely alluded to Miss Rand's deep contralto pronunciamentos and was particularly derisive of her definition of sense of life. You can just see that just dripping with sarcasm and no serious consideration of the ideas. But I'm proud to report that 45 years later, Kirkus Reviews had this to say about Who Says That's Art. As co-author of What Art Is, The Aesthetic Theory of Ayn Rand, Kamhi brings to her newest book decades of study and practical experience in the art world. She provides a history of visual arts as viewed by Aristotle, Kant, Rand, and others, and offers her list of basic assumptions about true art's essential characteristics. So notice, Rand is mentioned, there's no sarcasm, there's no innuendo. And in conclusion, Kirkus judged, who says that's art, to be an impressive companion for advanced studies in visual arts, accessible enough for general interest readers. So, based on my experience, what suggestions would I offer to anyone attempting to sell Rand's ideas to the larger world? First, never underestimate anti-Randian bias, which continues in the culture. It is out there and it is nasty, and I'll give you a recent example. This is what a prominent professor of art education posted on the Amazon.com page for my book. Kamhi's ideas are grounded in Kantian aesthetics as reworked by right-wing ideologue Ayn Rand, whose views are so far removed from the intellectual climate of our time, so utterly disengaged that she and her followers represent a kind of cult. So, you know, obviously this is a person who hasn't even got the spelling of her name right, but that kind of attitude is still very, very prominent. In a case like this, as I say, it's obvious that it's based on third-hand knowledge, but some who have read Rand's work also adamantly reject it. And this is true even of individuals who might expect to find value in it. For example, both the conservative poet Dana Gioia, who served as the head of the National Endowment for the Arts from 2003 to 2009, and the libertarian philosopher Dennis Dutton, founder of the influential web portal Arts and Letters Daily and author of The Art Instinct, which made a big flurry in the media a few years ago when it came out, informed Lou and me, because we had some email correspondence with him, and we also met him at a talk that he gave about his book in New York, informed us that though he agreed with, or that they agreed with or were influenced by other aspects of Rand's philosophy, they had little use for her theory of art. And these are people who were writing on art and aesthetics. In such instances, it's useful to try to understand where the impediment lies and to recognize and concede that in some cases the problem may lie in Rand's work itself, in her own lapses as a thinker and writer, from her idiosyncratic pronouncements that were not always grounded in fact, as I noted in yesterday's talk on understanding and appreciating art, to her frequently off-putting tone and manner, alluded to in some of the reviewers' comments I've quoted. With those hurdles in mind, here are my basic suggestions, simple do's and don'ts for any presentation or discussion related to Rand's work. The first is, the second, because the first one is don't underestimate anti-Randian bias, but as a kind of corollary, that focus on the ideas, not on Ayn Rand's name. That is absolutely crucial. Of course, you mention in a footnote, but don't start out by saying, as Ayn Rand says, as though that will necessarily convince your readers or audience. The other, in focusing on the ideas, rather on her, one of the things that will be likely to come up are attacks on her as a person. And we all know there were problematic aspects of her personal life and her personality. And I think it's important to say the ideas transcend that. She was not the perfect model of the things that she advocated or the principles that she was promoting. The second, and I think this is awfully helpful, and I think that the Kirkus review kind of confirms this, it's very important to know about others' work in the field and to point out where there are similarities and to acknowledge that what other thinkers have said on the subject may be of some interest. Rand was a brilliant thinker, but there have been other brilliant thinkers, and you'll increase your credibility by showing you're aware of them. You get very far by proclaiming that all truth and knowledge resides in Rand. She wasn't omniscient, and nor was she infallible. And then once you've established comparisons with other thinkers, you can show where her ideas are distinctive and what her particular contribution is over and above all of the others. Another caveat I would say is avoid using idiosyncratic expressions familiar only to objectivists, such as metaphysical value judgments, when worldview might do just as well and your audience would not be lost. And whenever possible, try to translate Rand's ideas into your own words. There's always the risk that you may misinterpret, or some more knowledgeable objectivist might say, that's not what we think she meant, but I think it's a risk worth taking, because until you can do that, you haven't really digested the ideas. The other thing, and this is awfully important, and I see this a lot, be open to seeing when another thinker has said much the same thing she said using different words, using different terms. And a classic case of this that was quite a surprise to us was discovering that in the place where Kant was talking specifically about the fine arts, he was saying essentially the same thing as Rand. Not as clearly and not with her background theory of mind, but he was essentially saying that art concretizes ideas. So, pointing that out, I think, was significant. If many people come to reality and find the same certain principles or truths in it, it becomes a much more compelling. The truth of it begins to be evident. And finally, and this is again crucial, be ready to acknowledge errors and shortcomings. And I think this is perhaps the surest way to let people know you're not a robotic adherent. This one I cannot emphasize enough, and we saw it in the reviewers' comments about Rand. I think very often what put people off about her was not the content, but the manner of the expression. And that is so important. I can't tell you how many times I've had people come up to me and say, I don't agree with you, but I respect the way in which you are presenting the ideas, and it's important to have alternative viewpoints out there. And that's the beginning, because if you can't get that far, there's no possibility of discussion or debate. So, style and tone. Strive for civility, be reasonable, not dogmatic or fanatic. I should really be giving this talk at ARI, not here. But, and this is hard to do sometimes, especially if you get involved with online discussions, which I try to limit, but occasionally I do. And you've got to keep your cool. I think it's important to bear in mind that you're not just talking to the person you're engaging with, but there are all sorts of people who are listening and watching, and they're judging you by the way you present the ideas, and your chances of influencing them by doing things in the right way is greatly enhanced. I was interested just briefly while I was preparing this, at the last minute, I looked at Aristotle's Principles of Rhetoric, and I realized that this is what he talks about as ethos, the ethos of rhetoric. Have you dealt with Aristotle's rhetoric at all, Stephen? Yeah, is this not the issue of ethos in terms of establishing a rapport of trust with your audience? So stick to the argument. Don't get caught up in the emotional, and do it in the most impersonal way possible. Use effective methods of argument, and David Kelly's Art of Reasoning offers detailed instruction, well worth studying. But here's my brief amateur list of key principles. Offer concrete examples to illustrate points. One of my favorite pithy statements of Ayn Rand's was recognizing the need to dance back and forth between the abstract and the concrete, which is just a wonderful way it's absolutely essential. This morning in Marsh's seminar on the psychoepistemology of art, the discussion got really interesting when we started talking about particular works of art. That talking about the principles in the abstract is really doesn't work. That's one. To give you an example, in a recent discussion, I was confronted with the charge that academic or classical realist painting is often vapid. I agreed that much of it is, but then I showed this example and this example. And many of the people on the list agreed, well, this work wasn't vapid. Employing the Socratic method is helpful to get your opponent to concretize what it is that they are trying to say, so you have a better sense of how to respond, and also dealing with their basic assumptions, which sometimes difficult to identify. Identifying logical fallacies and inconsistencies in the other's arguments, and focus on the reasons behind your own conclusions. One of my frustrations in response to any of the work that we've done is that people reject the conclusion without rebutting your argument behind it. I mean, you might as well have just not done the work at all. You know, they believe that photography is an art. So that's it. How can you possibly argue otherwise? As a matter of fact, the professor of art education that I mentioned dismissively referred to me in a session as somebody who was so, totally out of the realm of this world that I actually thought that photography is not a fine art. Okay, examine the unintended consequences of other people's positions. Given my focus on art, I don't often become embroiled in discussions of political philosophy, but on one occasion I couldn't resist chiming in when a professor of art education posted a comment on an art ed discussion list expressing support for the welfare state. In response, I explained the libertarian view that forced charity through government programs, as opposed to voluntary private charity, breeds a destructive sense of entitlement on the recipient side and resentment on the taxpayer side. whereas voluntary charity engenders a much healthier spirit of benevolence on the side of the giver and gratitude on part of the recipient. I'm sure it was the first time that the people on that list had heard that argument. And I didn't get any reaction one way or the other, but at least the idea got put out there. The other that's always important in life is to try to understand the other guy's context and to see where common ground can be found and fruitful alliances can be formed. In the art education community, where I focused a lot of my effort, my best interactions have often been with people of deep religious faith. Far more than those on the left, we tend to agree regarding the need for standards, values, and so on. On one occasion, in a discussion, one of these friends, the subject of Rand's atheism came up in relation to politics. The friend expressed concern that unless we regard human rights as divinely ordained, America's political foundation will collapse. In response, I pointed out that Rand's view of natural rights really amounts to the same thing, that it's simply another way of saying that our rights are grounded in man's essential nature. I emphasized that we could agree on that even if we couldn't agree on the ultimate source of human nature, and that both positions provide a defense against the left's political inroads. I don't know if I persuaded her, but again, it was a point worth making, and maybe she was able to see that there's a consistency there. And this one is very important on a personal level. Recognize when it's time to bow out of a discussion. Conservation of time and energy. When you keep saying the same thing over and over, and obviously nobody is going to be changing their view, the ideas are out there, it's time to move on to something else. As a postscript, I'd like to add that when engaging in intellectual activism, it helps to bear in mind the perspective that Nathaniel Branden offered some years ago in answer to a question about objectivism's influence on the culture. He said, "Did objectivism play a role in influencing people? Of course. Did it do it alone? No. It's one of a whole stream of things coming together at a particular time in history. It isn't that objectivism alone, as we fantasized when we were young, like some kind of steamroller was going to transform the culture. It requires other voices from other angles happening more or less simultaneously before you will get to see real social change." So that's it. I'm ready to take your questions, comments.
Sometimes when I'm talking about Rand with people who have a conception of what she's supposed to be like,
yes,
I bring up the fact that when I read a book of her letters to young people and to people, like she had tons of correspondence. She worked so incredibly hard to correspond that I find I've never read things that are so generous.
Yes.
In nature, and
Yes,
people are
yes.
surprised.
Yes,
like,
yes.
her?
Yes.
Generous?
Yes.
Like, read the book,
Right.
it's amazing.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true. But I think also with Rand, she went through different periods in her life, and as we all do, and how she was able to respond to people had a large measure. But it's true that she did to ordinary readers who, she did not have to invest that kind of time in, but it was important to her. If she felt that someone was engaging with the ideas, she felt it was worth encouraging that and clarifying as true.
My question isn't related, but can you please bring some of your books back from your book signing, if you have any extras so we
they're
can buy them.
leftovers.
You're sold out.
Yeah, I don't think I could. I think that the bookkeeping on that would be more complicated. But the Barnes and Noble is there, and they're open late. You can go over. Thank you. Thank you very much. And you can order it online.
Michelle, I enjoyed your discussion of getting into the other person's context and how you related this different reasons for believing things, religious versus non-religious. When you say recognize time to bow out, you mentioned when the arguments are out there and it's just going around in circles, but I'm wondering if you have any concrete examples where this happened for you, where it just became obvious that you weren't making the effect that you might have wanted to have, and something that sort of jumped out and said, it's clear here that this is going nowhere?
Actually, I can think of one very, very prominent example. There's an older art educator whom I met at a conference. I made a comment in a Q&A that she, was interested or impressed by. And she started a conversation with me, and we became friendly. And owing to her efforts, I joined an organization, a local art education organization called the I'm blocking. It was of university art educators, University Council for Art Education, and I was on the board briefly. So I've had a cordial relationship and respectful relationship with her, but she disagrees with me totally on the subject of abstract art. And she's constantly sending me things, showing her position. And I said on a number of occasions on the phone, Sylvia, we're not going to change each other's position on this. You've had a lifetime of teaching about this, and it's not going. So we can let it. But she wants to keep engaging. But at this point, I don't respond anymore to the arguments because we're just going over the same ground again and again. Had an interesting experience. I posted a comment on an art blog that's fairly well known. It's on the Arts Journal website. A woman named Judith Dobrynski, who is a writer for the Wall Street Journal and so forth. And it also related to the issue of abstract art. And one of the regular followers of her blog responded to my comment saying he agreed with me, but it was clear from what he said that he completely misunderstood my position. So I wrote back and I said, I'm afraid that you misinterpreted me. I think that abstract art is essentially unintelligible. He wrote back and he said, I've bought your book and I would wonder if you would be willing. He is, by the way, I Googled him and he does abstract art, so not surprising that he's taken this issue on. He said, would you be willing to continue the conversation with me? So yes, I will. I said I couldn't now, but we'll see what comes of it. I don't expect to persuade him, but at least to clarify the position and let him know that there is a solid position for thinking that it's failed, that it really is not a successful art form. So, but I was struck by that. I didn't expect that anything positive would come of that exchange, and it was interesting. So there again, I think a question of how I doubt that he would have done that if I had stated what I did in a thoroughly obnoxious way, but who knows?
Hi. You mentioned that you didn't think photography was art.
Was a fine art, no.
Was a fine art. And I was wondering if you had seen the film Tim's Vermeer.
I did.
In which they talk about how Vermeer might have created his artworks using lenses, and that was almost analogous to photography. I was wondering what you might have to say about that.
As it happens, a review of my book that's going to be out in the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, I think later this year, but I've gotten an advance copy of it, and I've had a chance to respond to it, he raised the same question. And I say, he said, would my estimation of Vermeer be lowered if indeed it were proven that he used that? And I said, yes, because part of what we admire about an artist is the skill that goes into creating it. And I tend to be skeptical because there is so much evidence of the brilliant draftsmanship of artists, not just Vermeer. I mean, in his case, it's tempting to make the argument because I don't think there were any extant drawings by him. But that doesn't mean he didn't do drawings. It doesn't mean that there wasn't, some kind of underdrawing on the painting. So I tend to not buy that too much. But if it were proven, I would say yes, he would definitely go down in estimation because it then becomes a much more mechanical process.
One more question, I think.
Hi, thank you very much.
Welcome.
I know when I look at visual art, I have kind of a thing. If I can do it, it ain't art. Having said that,
Which is what Mayor Giuliani said when there was a big brouhaha in New York over some controversial stuff. And I agree. I applauded that.
I didn't know that, but I always thought he was pretty smart. Having said that, when you say that something doesn't meet the definition of, or in your estimation, doesn't live up to whatever fine art is there a definition that you work with to determine that?
Yeah, well, it basically, I mean, I deal with this in some detail in the book. It's basically Rand's idea that the fine arts selectively recreate reality. In our first book, we used the phrase from Sunday in the Park with George, which says, bit by bit over time. An artist starts with a blank slate, whether it's a writer, a novelist, a painter, essentially, and every choice that the artist makes is significant. Whereas the photographer, there's a mechanical process that is largely responsible. I mean, you can alter the composition or the lighting or so forth, but then it's an overall determination, and there isn't the detailed response, the detailed recreation of reality.
So you would say that's art, but not fine art?
There's a craft. Interestingly, we discovered that the great photographer Cartier Bresson was also an artist. And he quit photography quite a number of years before he started to devote his attention to his art. And he said that making a drawing and making photography, they're two fundamentally, one is a craft and one is an art. And ironically, the website devoted to him refers to him as an artist, the artist. So I wrote to the executor of the Institute and I said, are you aware that he said that he didn't regard his photography as art? She said, that doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what he said about it. So,
Thank you for another wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
You are always stimulating.
Thank you.
Now, I make those puzzles out there, and I call myself an artist. They're like mosaics. I know there are many categories of art these days. I exhibit in art festivals. They're billed as art festivals, which are a mixture of fine painters with the most exquisite skills. There are photographers. They call themselves fine art photography. They are exquisitely done. You can't even tell them from a painting sometimes, because the artist has to check the lighting and the focus and all those details. So they're qualified to be in art shows, yes. And they let me in. So there are art shows with my stuff in it as well. Now, I was saying something. I got sidetracked, sorry. So the work I do, which I call playable art, is unique. No one else does it. They really don't always know how to judge me or how to categorize me, but they let me in anyway.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to offer you my usual haiku for the presentation that you gave today. This is the lesson that I drew from it. Shared truths open doors, where concretes and abstracts merge. Common ground yields fruit. So
Very nice.
I hope that in future we will persuade people. As Brandon said, it will take many people from many sides because ideas have lives of their own.
Mm-hmm.
And when they get together, there is a struggle. We see this everywhere. And we don't realize it's really the ideas
Yes.
that are fighting for their own survival, not just the people that they inhabit.
Yeah.
And I'm very optimistic that with people like these and like you, someday rationality will prevail.
I don't know if you would feel the same way if you were at an art education conference these days, but it's important to come where there are some people of sanity who agree with you. So thank
It's
you.
the disagreements that people get into, and they become emotionally bound to them, and they tie themselves up in knots defending things, and then they block you completely. They build a concrete wall so
Yes.
your ideas are not allowed in.
Right, and then
And we need some way to overcome those walls.
yes.
Thank you for what you contribute.
You're welcome. I just want to clarify, one of the confusions in talking about art is that it's a term that refers to many different concepts, and what we emphasized in What Art Is, and also I do in the new book, is that I'm talking about the concept of fine art, or what people used to refer to as art with a capital A, which was a very particular category of certain kinds of objects and activity. And decorative art is art, but it's a different kind of art. And photography has artistic elements to it, and as I say in the book, I would give I put much more value in a very good photograph than in an awful painting. So, to say that something is a photograph or it's not art does not necessarily mean it isn't significant or valuable.
All right, well, we'll let Michelle get to her book signing, but let's first thank her.
Thank you.